Today's case study is wrapping up the major part of our year. We're in a situation where we've been doing this case study all the way back in September until now, which I think is the largest automation case study done. In fact, our case study has had a lot of traction and more people wanting to jump in, so we'll be continuing in January as well. This is the 6th case study webinar. And on this webinar, we're going to continue our supply chain discussion. The last time around, Max had a great presentation about how the supply chain stuff works around automation. We're going to recap that very briefly. And then we're going to continue in talking about how do you make the supply chain automation work in practice, moving from the tooling to the process. Before we get started, here's our antitrust policy notice. As always, I show this at the beginning of every meeting. If you want to read our full antitrust policy at the Linux Foundation, you can go to the link listed in the slide. And if you're from a Linux Foundation member company, you can go and talk to our counsel, Andy Updegrove. Right. So the automation case study is part of the larger mission of OpenChain of raising all the boats in the supply chain. So the purpose of our ISO standard, the purpose of our work groups, the purpose of our reference material is to help every company improve how they do open source compliance. This is because we know that means that they'll be able to do business more effectively, more quickly, and more cheaply. We also know that it's vitally important in open source that we all have the same rules and we all have the same certainty. This makes sure that we can work together and it makes sure we can bring products to market. So our community has expressed, and the discussion became very clear last year and this year, that automation is probably the most important thing we can do in the supply chain after having the existence of our ISO standard. So our standard explains the key processes, the key things to do for a quality compliance program. Automation allows you to do that at scale. Now, we've talked about automation and solutions out there over the last 2 years. We've had a ton of webinars covering aspects of this, and we have had some great engagement from the community. As well as these webinars, we do have an extremely active tooling work group that meets every 2 weeks. It is a remarkable place to get started, to get help, and to iterate and improve. The people have great knowledge. In fact, this case study is based on these people, their work, and the corpus of knowledge they've built. You can check out our webinars here. That's where all of the webinars, I think we're on webinar 35 now, and about, I guess, 1/3 to half of them touch on tooling. You can look at them all there and you can catch up. What we're doing with this automation case study is we're bringing things together. We want to tie things together so it's easy to understand how the tooling fits into your business, how and why automation works and is challenging, how and why automation can be easy, and how and why you can begin using automation without spending a lot of money. Now, when we're talking about automation, what we're really talking about nowadays is how do we do stuff with software bill of materials? You know, we're talking about the supply chain and OpenChain. And we're talking about how you can use a software bill of materials like SPDX to ingest and export information about compliance. We're especially interested in how a very simple starting point, SPDX Lite, could work. In other words, what's the minimum you can do as a company to identify your file, to identify its version, to identify its license, and to be able to share that with your colleagues or your customers or your suppliers. SPDX stuff can look like this. and this information can be read by a human or a machine. Now, if it's the first time you've ever seen information like that, you might think, how do I read it? But trust me, basically there are tags, and then there's information which is shown against the tags. And when you get used to it, it becomes a very quick and easy way to get the hang of things. And for machines, it's even quicker and easier. Really, and this is a nice figure which Max brought into the last webinar, you can see how tooling around SBOMs looks at how you produce and consume and transform software. So, whether it's SPDX or something else, that's roughly what it's doing. Here's what Max was looking at in the last webinar. He was doing a virtual supply chain, taking an example of some code based on languages like Rust and WebAssembly. He was talking about how you build some of the code and how you deploy it in an environment such as a Docker container. Now, doing that does introduce potential borders. It can be different organizations doing different aspects of this build and deploy. And when you have multiple organizations doing that, or multiple departments in your organization, you start to have a situation where you need a common language to share information quickly. And the common language around things like compliance, whether it's license or security, is a software bill of materials. Now, Max went on to create a specific setup where there were 4 organizations doing that process of taking this Rust and WebAssembly code and deploying it into the cloud. He described how open source fits into this. He described the points where you would want to have, for instance, SPDX information, and how you would transfer it between the organizations. So all of that is the workflow of how you can have a supply chain using something like SPDX to keep track of who's doing what. Now, in our context, we're always thinking license compliance, but that keeping track is equally important in other areas. It's important in, as I mentioned before, security. It's also important on a pure engineering level so that you can keep track of where everything is and how to fix things if you need to. How do we get this to work in the supply chain? Those illustrations from Max show us very clearly how the workflows themselves can be, but how do we get this to work? The physical aspect of automation was just demonstrated. And we know there's open source tools for open source compliance. And this allows us, in theory, to begin to use automation for free with supportive communities. One popular example of tooling that can do that is the open source review toolkit. And the open source review toolkit is used extensively. It's very popular. And it's certainly a great way to work on this in the supply chain. And there's a lot more. There's other tools as well, like Fossology, SW360, ScanCode, Opossum, which is the user interface we've been demonstrating in this case study, showing how easy it is to use that to call other tools. And of course, more specialized things like specific SPDX tools. There's a document linked here which shows you that ecosystem of tooling, which in particular supports the SPDX software bill of materials. Our challenge is to realize the potential. And this takes us back to process management, something that we have mentioned before, but I want to dig into specifically on the optic of I'm a company, I'm in the supply chain, what do I do? Okay, so we're talking about supplier relationship management. And in this context, I think there's 3 useful options available. There's requesting software bill of materials, requiring software bill of materials, and education around software bill of materials. Now, your ability to use these 3 options depends on where you are in the supply chain. Are you at the very beginning, the very end, or the middle? For example, if you're at the very beginning of the supply chain, it may be difficult for you to require that the companies at the end of the supply chain utilize a software bill of materials. And your strategy may be different. You would use requests and education instead. Let's dig into those. So requesting is probably the simple one. You can ask companies above and below you whether they support a standardized bill of materials. And if they do, you can assess with them whether you can all support that standardized software bill of materials. If they don't, you can begin looking at a standardized bill of materials like SPDX, and you can discuss with them whether this would make all of your lives easier. On the other hand, if especially you're a customer company, you can require that your suppliers support standardized bill of materials. If you're towards the end point, if you're something like a tier 1 automotive supplier, or if you're a consumer electronics company, you can say to your suppliers, look, we want to make sure there's a software bill of materials with the software deliverables, and we will adopt, for example, SPDX. So we want you to use that too. And the third option, of course, is that you can share information with your suppliers, peers, and customers on the value of supporting standardized software bill of materials. You can engage with projects like SPDX. You can get companies using SPDX to do presentations in your supply chain, and you can help everyone understand why this is a really good idea. Now, it all starts with identifying the value. And this image here just shows some of the basic value of something like an SPDX software bill of materials. You get to know what the file is, what the version is, where it came from. And you get to know things additional to that with other tags like license information. The value of that is pretty immediately apparent. And of course, once you look at the basic value, you can understand then how it works. Here's an example of how SPDX files can be structured. You don't need all of this information. It's just an example of the type of things you can do. And after that, if you so wish, you can look at how that would scale across multiple areas of dealing with software. Now, that might look a little bit daunting. That's a lot of information on a slide. But basically, it comes back to nothing is more important than education for your organization and your supply chain. That's really the key. You know, it's simple to start using software bill of materials. You can start with just basic, clear information like this that can be read by a human or a machine with a glance. And that's the beginning. That beginning doesn't have to be sophisticated. It doesn't even have to be automated. You can use that type of information in a spreadsheet or a checklist or even a sticky note. The sticky note is not recommended, but it is possible. You can start almost anywhere, and then you can build from there. A common journey is for companies to start with a spreadsheet and then to later move towards automation. That would probably be the most common journey for companies in the supply chain over the last 15 years. Companies beginning now have an advantage because everyone has worked on this before. They can quickly start somewhere else. But a lot of companies do this, spreadsheet to automation. And if you start with something like SPDX, or you move to something like SPDX early in your development, early in your process, your evolution becomes a lot simpler, faster, and cheaper. Because you can use SPDX in that spreadsheet. It's just tags. And then you can easily move it into a tool like open source review toolkit. And from then on, you can automate things so that your human review is reduced and the automation review cuts time dramatically. Now, when you come to the bigger picture here, you're looking at a series of benefits and the question of how those benefits work. You know, what are the process points where things can occur with automation? And here's an image created by Oliver Fent of Siemens that I think is very useful for showing how from inbound to outbound, you can have points in the development lifecycle here at CI/CD where you can get automation that's helpful. And when you're ready, you can begin inserting tools into those points. And open source tools like Open Source Review Toolkit solve specific items in that CI/CD infrastructure. Now, this is just an example to show you the type of open source tools for open source compliance that can help in the specific domain of developing software. Of course, that's not everything. What about vendor companies? You know, a lot of people are using tooling and automation services from companies like those above. This list of companies are companies that are inside the OpenChain ecosystem as vendor partner companies. So all of these companies have engagement around open source. They've got engagement in the OpenChain community. And if you want to use their tooling or automation services, the question is probably, do you support import and export of SPDX? And ideally, they should do so that you can transfer this information to other companies who can ingest it and import it and then export it further. And ultimately, whether you are using open source tools for open source compliance or you are using vendor tools, it doesn't matter because a software bill of materials is in operation. So that's the big sweep. That's it. Max covered the mechanics of how this virtual supply chain works, and we've just covered the process approach, the whys, the hows of how you do that in the industry, in the supply chain. There's a series of links that you should probably take a look at. There's the open source review toolkit, scan code, turn. Scan code, by the way, scans files, software repositories. Turn scans containers. There's Fossology, Lite, and SPDX Tools. There's SPDX itself. You can find SPDX on the ISO pages as well. And of course, there's SPDX Lite, which is the minimal subset I mentioned earlier. We're talking about a very small subset of SPDX to get started quickly if you want to have human and machine readable stuff from the ISO standard ISO IEC 5692. And that's it. It's actually a relatively simple overview and a relatively simple process approach. And the tooling, while there's great diversity in your choice, fundamentally, if you're using a standardized software bill of materials, your choice is all about preferences for what makes it faster and easier for your engineers to address compliance, what makes it faster and easier for you to do remediation if something goes wrong, and what makes it faster and easier to satisfy your suppliers, your peers, and your customer companies as people merge around software bill of materials. I'm going to stop there and see if we have any questions at this time. I notice Stephen is unmuted. Hi, Stephen.
Yeah. Hello. I don't have a question, but I'd like to say that's a fantastic summary and presentation. Really good job. I'm definitely planning to steal that and show that to managers. Thank you.
The presentation will be available under the usual CC0, do whatever you want with it, OpenChain license.
Thanks.
I'm glad you found it useful. And, you know, we have had such tremendous work from the tooling work group. We've had so many contributions chiseling away at this topic. We've had a lot of work, 10 years of work in SPDX for software bill of materials. And we've had the OpenChain project putting 2 years into thinking about this in the context of supply chain management. So that's why it all comes together and why I think we covered the essence of automating the supply chain in just 46 slides. So I think that's due to a lot of people talking a lot, and then we whittle it down to the core. I'm hoping these slides will be translated into several languages. Particularly, I'm going to ask our friends in the Chinese government, our friends in the OpenChain working group, our friends in the China work group, and of course, the government and user companies in Korea to consider having it in our CJK, China, Japan, Korea language availability. One of the biggest changes we might be able to make to the supply chain is having, and this is the scale thing, having tens of thousands of companies become aware that this is less of a challenge than they thought, because there's more support than they knew about. And because you can download and get started with a tool really quickly. Like if you use Opossum, you have a graphical user interface that can call a scanning tool like ScanCode, and you can get started very fast, clicking Go Scan, and you get your results. Any further questions or comments?
I guess it's kind of obvious question from my side. So yeah, like, well, thanks Shane for this presentation. But is there some sort of table that would give like what are the suppliers able to provide, like CycloneDX or SPDX, and same for the open source tools?
It's a really good question. I think that we don't yet have a table for that. As far as I know, in the market, there are three major software bill of materials for open source. SPDX is in market about 10 years. It's just been granted ISO status, and it's probably the largest and most comprehensive one. You can use it for license compliance, security, export control, whatever you want. Then there's CycloneDX, which is far newer. It came out of the security domain. I think it's still primarily focused on that area. And it has some good traction in some areas. And then there's a much older standard as an ISO standard called SWID. SWID, I think, was a very early to market ISO standard for this quite a few years ago, at least 4 or 5 years ago. I think it has less traction than the other two, but I mean, they're all options and they're all valid. And it's also valid but not optimal to go and invent your own software bill of materials in your supply chain. Actually, that's what most people in the early days and a lot of the current supply chain is doing. They have bespoke software bill of materials. And it's like, this is what company A will accept from us. So that's what we do. The problem with that is it doesn't scale. And because you have to use different bespoke software bill of materials for different customer companies, you make mistakes. If you use a standardized software bill of materials, you reduce those mistakes and you reduce the time spent. But yeah, I don't think there's a table yet, Mary. And maybe that's something we can ask the SPDX community to work on. Particularly, remember, I think it was a couple of presentations or webinars ago, we had a look at some of the stuff the EU was doing around licensing. And they sort of showed what each license does. It might be kind of cool to have something showing what the software bill of materials do as you make your decisions around them. Yeah, well, that's a to-do for our software bill of materials friends. And for those of you who are listening to this webinar, Sebastian just came in. That was the second November Global Workgroup meeting. We have so many meetings in OpenChain and so much information. It's like a fire hose, but we do try and organize it for you. So when you come back to it, when you're entering it and looking at our webinars, it's easier. Yes, and I think what we're looking at now, as we enter 2022, is that there's a family of projects out there. OpenChain is one, and we are the maintainers of the ISO standard for open source license compliance. We are a very active, very large global community addressing compliance and governance in general. We contribute a lot of information to other projects and activities because of that. We produce a lot of material around security, a lot of material around software bill of materials, a lot of material around open source program offices, training, and other stuff. But we are not an island isolated. For instance, SPDX, which is an ISO standard, has SPDX project maintaining it. And you can get specific domain knowledge from them. And they can also produce specific domain knowledge for us. Like, after this call, I'm going to contact SPDX and say, how about a comparison table between the software bill of materials to aid choices? There are other projects too. Open source review toolkit, that's a project. Turn, the container scanner, project. Scan code, project. And all of these projects are interrelated. We use our meetings inside OpenChain to talk about tooling. Those projects have their own mailing lists and they talk about us, and so on and so forth. If I was to choose one thing as the theme for OpenChain in 2021, apart from our growth as an ISO standard in the supply chain, one thing apart from that, it would be that we are grand central station for governance and compliance. We catch all the discussions around the world and we funnel them to more specific projects. And we also ask more specific projects to provide information so we can share it outwards around the world. And that's what this automation thing is all about. We have an automation work group, but we don't maintain automation tools. There's projects to do that. But we are in a position to tell many, many people about the overviews and to help encourage them to get engaged and to help encourage them to save a ton of time, a ton of money, and a ton of headaches in addressing open source license compliance. Just saw a note from Alex that tools are getting easier to use. Yes, they are. They were too difficult to use. And the last couple of years has really been about how do we lower the barrier to entry. Sebastian's hand is up. Hey, Sebastian, over to you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask about the archival of software bill of materials.
Yes.
Because as your previous slides shown, there's been a terrific growth in the tooling ecosystem for generating them, but archiving them is going to become very important, and it's part of the OpenChain specification, if I'm not mistaken.
You're right.
Go on. I'm really.
Well, I guess the question is, how do you archive? And is there
exactly?
Yeah.
And then what's the best way to archive when there are many such options?
Yes. And unfortunately, the answer is that we haven't done enough work in this space. And by that, I don't mean OpenChain specifically, I mean the market. We still are in a situation where people archive stuff in their own ways. But there are some good examples of archiving that I think you can use straight away. One older example is the project SW360, which is a software catalog. So you get your scans, you put it in there, and then you can review the scans later. So SW360 is an example of archiving. Another type of archiving, more of shared archiving of common code, is a project called Clearly Defined. And Clearly Defined, written as one word, is a sort of more open cross-company way of archiving information. So SW360 is internal to you. It's sort of your database management for compliance information. And then Clearly Defined is more of a project, an open project with open data. Now, tools themselves have ways of archiving, like Open Source Review Toolkit has ways of ingest and supporting that material. Where we need to improve in the market, where we can do a great job, I suppose, in the future, is the question of, apart from exporting everything as SPDX and re-importing it into another bespoke database, can we have shared database formats and approaches? And the answer is yes. And the answer is probably we are going to go there. One example, and this is mental modeling. I'm not saying that this will be the way you do it, but one example is software heritage, which is building the long-term archive of software. And by software, I mean all software. Now, the knowledge they're generating as they archive all of this software and have ways to access it is probably the knowledge that will bleed into the future of open source compliance artifact archiving. So, they're already showing that this works at scale, and they're showing how they structure it, and you can access it from them. You can browse the world's software code. So I think that that's the answer. We have catalogs today. We probably need to move into better formats for storing the data. And we'll probably be inspired by software heritage to do it.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I have not heard of SW360 before, so that will be a nice avenue for my research. Thank you very much again.
Oh yeah, recommend it. There's been work on SW360 from companies like Siemens and Bosch. And while nowadays, I think those same companies are trending towards open source review toolkit, the fact that SW360, which is an Eclipse Foundation project, it's been used for years. It's very target focused on software cataloging, and therefore it's a great place to start with research. The only proviso I'd have is, I think it represents the concept of storing your catalog in your company, which is a perfectly valid concept. But there may be slightly different concepts in play in the future when you're talking about universal archives. Yari, am I hearing blockchain when we talk about archiving? Yeah, possibly. The problem with blockchains is, while they provide an immutable database, so it's a great record because it can't be changed, their transaction per second is miserable. And we already have problems with software bill of materials in areas such as reading SPDX with XML. Because if you're dealing with 40 million lines of code, recompiling every hour, those XML documents are too slow to parse. So people are moving, or have moved, to JSON and other formats that are faster. The average blockchain has difficulty moving past, let's see, Bitcoin is somewhere around 10 transactions per second. And the modern generation 3 blockchains are somewhere around 3,000 per second. And they're working on now what they call level 2 blockchains, which will allow you to run blockchain forks that sync occasionally. So you can do a multiple, run 10 of those, you've got 30,000 per second, run 100, and suddenly you've got 300,000 per second. But you still have the question of, how do we do the processing back into the central database, and how do we read that? So Yari, I actually think blockchain is not unfeasible. I think in particular, when you're moving an entire compliance artifact company to company in a supply chain, let's say medical, blockchain has a realistic chance of use. But for general software cataloging, I don't think it's performant enough. And probably the best thing is just to use Postgres SQL. So the future will probably be hybrid, where you have immutable data recorded in certain industries for certain purposes. And most people just use standard databases. I hope that comment makes sense. Right.
Perfectly, like it was a little bit like, as a joke, but
I know.
then, when thinking further, I don't know if somebody makes some release that might be going to blockchain,
Yeah.
I think there are options there.
I think in particular with medical, it's got potential, because if you've just done a release of your vaccine, which is now in a sealed cryogenic box, which is software controlled, you want to know the record of exactly when that left your facility, when it was handed off, and so on and so forth. And mostly we have pre-existing processes that work really well, but they work in the context of pre-existing refined economies. It won't necessarily be the same when you're delivering that same vaccine into some areas of sub-Sahara Africa, and that's, or some areas of Tennessee probably. And that's where, you know, you're looking at a situation where you may want immutable records because there isn't the infrastructure in place right now. And you want to make sure that what's happening there is just as solid as what's happening in Switzerland. So yeah, I'm a person who is both pro and anti-blockchain. I think it has specific uses, but I think that a lot of the discourse around blockchain is always looking at potential as opposed to realization. And as of yet, we've realized blockchain utility in very few areas. By the way, I did know that your comment was tongue-in-cheek. I went on this tangent because recently I've been involved in blockchain technology around communications. And previously in the OpenChain project, we collaborated with Hyperledger on a proof of concept blockchain method of tracking software with the intent of showing how that could work around OpenChain. That Hyperledger project is called SParts, so the letter S and parts as one word. And again, that was just a prototype. It was just a proof of concept. It was done by Mark Giese about 4 years ago. And it was a valid exploration. And I think it said to us that this area has certain potential and certain drawbacks. And we'll just have to wait and see in our supply chain management. All righty. Any further questions or comments? Okay, if there's nothing else, we will end case study 6 here, and it becomes my job to edit and upload it so our global community can review it. Thank you everyone for being part of this. Thank you to Max for not only doing a lot of work, but for committing so much time into thinking through these problems for the benefit of the community. Take care, everyone. Have a lovely day.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Have a nice day. Bye.
Bye.